Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Hard though it is to believe, but I think even more so than will.i.am yesterday, our next speaker needs no introduction. He is, of course, Bill Gates, and he's co-chair of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and, of course, co-founder of Microsoft, and he'll be talking to us via a video link. Hi, Bill. Welcome.
Well, good afternoon.
So I would like to invite you to say a few words, and then we'll move over to a question and answer session after that. Over to you.
Well, thank you. Well, I'm sorry I can't be there in person. I'm here in Washington, D.C., and excited to get this opportunity to talk about the magic of engineering and some of the opportunities and challenges ahead. You know, certainly my own career, starting with the work at Microsoft, gave me a chance to be involved in some of the most exciting engineering ever. The miracle of the microprocessor, of fiber optics, of incredible storage, meant that software could do things that people had never dreamed of before. And in fact, I think I benefited a lot that I was very young at a time when computers were making exponential improvements. And a lot of the people who'd worked with computers in the past had this image of them as very large, very expensive, very limited in what they could do. And we, because we were coming in sort of with a fresh mind, looking at Moore's law and the implication, and focused on the software piece that had not been the critical piece, we were able to see a very different way of using computing, to think about the personal computer that we wanted for ourselves, as well as making that a product for the world. And so specializing in software, building operating systems, building tools, building things like Office, video editing, all sorts of amazing things, really was a big benefit to have leverage out of whatever creativity, desire to reach out to others that people have. And so I'd say, the personal computer and all the software around it and the new devices, tablets, phones, are really a great manifestation of innovative engineering. And when you look at the progress of humanity going back to, say, 1700, the time of the very, very first steam engine, till today, the progress has really been phenomenal. And you can point to engineering as the reason that's taken place. We went a long time where the amount of calories people had, the average longevity, the percentage who got to become literate and have reasonable free time was very, very little progress on those things. And it was only when engineering got to a certain critical mass, including energy intensification, that life started to improve in some pretty dramatic ways. In my first career at Microsoft, it was about the personal computing and creating a tool that fortunately has become a very mass tool, now literally used by billions of people. And it's been amazing to see the phenomena that's grown up around it, not just the software companies, but the whole idea of taking information, whether it's biological genetic information or simulations of creating new products and trying those out in a pure digital world. It's been amazing that these computers are to some degree the handmaiden of engineering and the sciences in the same way that mathematics was throughout the centuries. And so it's really helping us accelerate both the collaboration and the progress that can be made on engineering innovation. Starting 5 years ago, I changed my full-time focus, and now that's entirely at the Gates Foundation. And our foundation works in two major areas. One is working in education, and part of that is seeing where technology can come in and make education better and more affordable, which is, of course, very, very important for all subject areas. The second and the largest, about 75% of what we do, is looking at the needs of the poorest and how many innovations have not been focused on them. And so it's very important to have grants and getting the best minds together to think about how we uplift the living conditions of the very poorest. We still have countries in the world where almost 20% of the children die before the age of 5. And we ought to be able to change that. It was pretty stunning to me when I first got into this work to understand how much the priorities for innovation had been tilted by the marketplace imperatives. So for example, something like a malaria vaccine that you'd probably rank in humanistic terms as one of the great innovations that you'd like to see, literally was receiving almost no funding. When we first put in a grant of only 20 million, we became the greatest funders in that area. Whereas other things, like working on male baldness or some other things that you wouldn't think of as necessarily important because of the voice in the marketplace of the people who have those interests, that was getting an order of magnitude more research than something like malaria. So the role of governments and philanthropy coming in and offsetting to some degree what you might consider one of the few flaws in the pure capitalistic approach is to take the basic sciences, the underinvestments, the focus on the needs of the poorest and make sure that the innovation agenda is focusing in those areas. Overall, I'm very optimistic about the progress that we'll be able to make, even though some of the challenges are daunting. For example, feeding the world when we have a population of close to 10 billion, and we'll have not only the population increase, but the intensification of diet through meat consumption. Will we be able to meet that challenge? Well, assuming that we don't allow climate change to go too far against agricultural productivity, the kind of advances we can have through the genetic revolution, which although has primarily been focused on human health, those deep understandings, those tools apply equally well to understanding seeds and the key crops in the world. So the opportunity through conventional breeding and other techniques is to make very substantial improvements in productivity. Our foundation spends a lot of money in the agriculture area, but the biggest area for us is in the work on infectious disease. This idea of grand challenges, I think, is fantastic. Anything we can do to spark the imagination of people who are considering coming into engineering or science, anything we can do to get people focused on what the big problems are, I think that's super helpful. For helping out the poorest, we still need quite a few things. Even very simple things like keeping vaccines refrigerated. You'd think that'd be fairly straightforward, but in the environment where there's no electricity, delivering diesel or propane is very difficult. We still literally have tens of thousands of children who die because this vaccine supply chain doesn't have the right tools. That is, the extra cost, the complexity, the amount that spoil, the lack of coverage that comes out of that is one of the reasons why we still have a lot of deaths that really shouldn't take place. One of the metrics that I track most closely, and the foundation working with its partners has very ambitious goals for, is the under 5 mortality. If you go back to the 1960s, over 20 million children a year were dying. And that was tragic. It's diseases like smallpox, diarrhea, measles, malaria, pneumonia. Those are the big killers. By 1990, that number had come down to 12 million. And that's pretty phenomenal progress because that's in a time where the total population of kids under the age of 5 almost doubled in size. So it's quite a reduction. However, the greatest reduction ever in history is what's taken place between 1990 and the present time. We've gone down from the 12 million we had then to now we're down below 7 million. And the majority of that is ascribable to taking vaccines, inventing some new vaccines, taking vaccines that were created for the rich world where the actual risk of disease is much lower, and making sure that they get out to the poorest countries. And so, for example, in diarrhea, a third of those deaths are caused by rotavirus, and we have a fantastic vaccine for that. and it is now rolling out to all the children of the world. As I said, we still need to invent a number of new ones, including for diseases that also include adults, tuberculosis vaccine, AIDS vaccine, but the science is moving forward, and we're definitely getting a lot more people engaged in these issues, which, that's the thing that will really drive the progress there. Funding for these things has improved, and so I think setting a very ambitious goal, say in the next 15 years, before 2030, getting the number of children who die under the age of 5 below 3 million should absolutely be possible. It means we have to get much better coverage out there. We'll have to get the malaria vaccine. We'll have to improve this supply chain, including that refrigeration piece. But I absolutely believe that that's possible. I mentioned the imperatives of climate change. And if you think of any one problem that sort of takes science and engineering and politics and investing now to take care of a problem that there is a great deal of uncertainty around, but clearly a huge problem. This is a really serious issue. The thing that would be ideal, of course, is engineering innovation that gives us not only low-cost power, but also power that emits no CO2. And so when I think about that grand challenge, it's got to be inexpensive and non-CO2 emitting. This generation of engineers will be faced with that challenge. Certainly governments can be doing more to fund the basic research. There's many different lines of attack that problem can be solved on. But this is one where we need to actually solve it very quickly. We don't have the luxury of just simply waiting until some approach comes along, because as time goes on, it's particularly the poorest whose agriculture is always on the edge with drought and flood. They're the ones who will feel the pain of this, which is, ironic and unjust in a lot of ways, because they are not the ones who contributed to it at all. And so I have a basic optimism about the problems that we'll solve and the progress that we'll make. When anybody says something's unsolvable, I think, well, they haven't really thought through innovation and the role it can play. If you think through where we've come over the last 100 years, the last 20 years, it's science and engineering delivered into the marketplace with some extra effort to think about the needs of the poor that really have gotten us so far. And this positive message of what engineering's been able to achieve is one that I find that we don't talk about enough. And I think we can really embolden people by thinking about the challenges and what's important. So it's fantastic you've gotten this group together, and I'm excited to be a part of the event. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bill. Okay, so we have about half an hour, and we have an audience probably bursting at the seams to ask you questions. We have roving mics. I'll take the chair's prerogative and maybe slip in an early question from me. You mentioned, obviously, your work, your interest in health in the developing world. What other fields of engineering would you say have probably the greatest potential to really improve the lives of the world's poorest people?
Well, I think you always have to consider the basics. Understanding material science will be very, very important. A lot of the increase in population that we'll have are going to live in Africa in urban slums. And so the question of how do you create shelter for them? How do you create air conditioning, heating, lighting, conditions that you would consider far, far better than what those slums look like today? Those are basic engineering problems. What are the materials? How do you make it inexpensive? When you think through what the minimum energy needs should be, it should be able to meet those. So, anyone who's giving us the tools that those new people are going to be able to take advantage of. I think there's so many engineering problems there. Let me just take one as an example, which is the toilet. The Economist had on the cover, this, I think, strange debate about whether there's great innovation coming in the future. And ironically, they picked the toilet, the thinker sitting on the toilet as kind of the iconic image of that. Well, we've got a bunch of challenges out to reinvent the toilet. That is, to create one that doesn't require bringing a lot of clean water in, messing it up, sending it back to a processing plant, to literally use some sort of processing techniques, burning, chemistry, to take care of that problem with a local inexpensive device. And when we ran the contest, we had a lot of great entrants, and I feel that we'll be able to go back to the Economist and say, look, here is a new toilet that is completely different and far better and meets the needs of all of humanity.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, it's over to the audience. And can I ask you, of course, I've mentioned this before, but to keep the microphone close to your mouth so that Bill can hear the entirety of the question. So the gentleman at the back there, just put your hand, yes. And then over there.
Philip Ledoux, Carnegie Mellon University. We actually have a Gates Foundation grant, and we are using a traditional cell mechanics approach to improve nutrition in children in third world countries like Africa. And so as part of this is translating science into something actual. We've spun a company out of this, and the company has a social context of actually developing this and deploying it into Africa. And then once we start looking for funders of this, for the investors as we move further downstream with it, the investors have said, that's not going to make a profit for us. And so the question is, can you actually do the social, build a social company and build a profitable company? Can you have your cake and eat it too? Is that possible?
Well, there are a number of areas where you can build a product that has value in rich world, middle income world, and the poorest, and ideally create a business model that lets you get your margin and your payback on your R&D and investment from the rich countries, the middle income countries, or some tiering of the customers in the developing countries themselves. So a good example of this is that the Arvind Eye Clinic in India, which does lens replacement, gives a really first-class, quick service to people who are willing to pay $50, and for others they do it absolutely for free. And they've made it balance out such, because their costs are about $20 for each of these surgeries, they're able to make that work. So, if somebody had a company with this new toilet, I think that would work very well, because lots of middle-income countries need that innovation, and you ought to be able to make a margin there, even if it's completely break-even being delivered to the poorest countries. In the area of nutrition, it's hard to know. Of course, nutrition is important for everyone, but the particular nutritional deficits that you've got in the poor countries are somewhat different. And getting the delivery in there, do you deliver through salt? Do you deliver through a daily pill? Do you biofortify the food in some way? It's a very significant delivery challenge. And of course, the science of nutrition is not as robust as we'd like. We have a lot of things where small studies show a very significant benefit than when we do the large studies, partly because of the variations in diet or health condition, ages. And we're not really absolutely sure. We don't see quite the effect that we expect there. So nutrition is super important. I hope that you can find a business model that justifies putting the effort in there, because it's an area that hasn't had quite enough thinking to figure out the basic problems, and we need very creative products that overcome this delivery challenge, particularly to kids at a young age. There's the broad nutrition problem, the macronutrition problem, and then there's particular deficits in the first even 3 years of life that you'd like to target into. So, we'd love to, I'd love to learn more, and I do think in general it takes a lot of creativity to get the best of both worlds.
Hello, Mr. Gates. I'm Youngmoo Kim. I'm a professor at Drexel University. And yesterday at this conference, we heard remarks from another William, and that's Will I Am from the Black Eyed Peas. And he spoke about the need to inspire kids to study science and engineering, and by elevating sort of the superstars of the field as rock stars, much as we do in sports with Michael Jordan or musical artists. As one of the few rock stars of our field who has really achieved greatness through science and technology, I'm just curious to hear what would you suggest as strategies for getting children, kids, students more interested in science and engineering and mathematics?
Well, definitely it's kind of surprising that we have such a deficit of people going into these fields, because both if you look at where you can have the most interesting job, where you can have a job that will pay very, very well, and where you can have the most impact on society. All three of those things line up to say, yes, go into science and engineering. Those are really great fields. And yet, in most rich countries, we see this decline. Asia's somewhat the exception still. And so, of course, there's a shift in terms of a lot of engineering activity to Asia, or even in the United States, to students who are Asian born. Now, in the last few years, at least one field, computer science, has seen the enrollment start to go back up again. So we're basically back to where we were in 1999 in terms of computer science. But if we take the sciences broadly, we still have big deficits, and in particular, we have huge deficits in terms of racial diversity and gender diversity. We're still really failing to get women in. And there must be something about how we teach the sciences and make them not seem that attractive, how we don't talk about these professions. I know that there's a lot of universities, including people like University of Texas at Austin, CMU, many that have been getting together and had pilot programs that show some promise. But we're losing kids, starting in elementary school, then in high school, then in college. People find it too daunting, even people who have the talent. So it's a dilemma, and I'm glad to be an icon of how much fun it is to be in engineering, and to any degree that can help.
Our next question, wait for the camera to swivel around to you. Yes.
Okay, well, first of all, I'd like to thank the Academy for this summit. It's been a very interesting 2 days. Secondly, in the spirit of this summit, I'd like to ask Mr. Gates, as an engineer in the pharmaceutical industry, so in medicine and health, what are the one or few things we can do as engineers in medicine to help you achieve the objectives of your foundation?
Well, there's some very clear goals in terms of drugs and vaccines that we want to have discovered. But if you go more, to the pure sort of engineering things, ideally we'd have something we'd call a drug depot. Why is it so much harder to get medicine used in developing world versus rich world? Part of the reason is that people have to go back and visit again and again, and that's very difficult. So, for example, if we could give you your TB medicines for 60 days into some depot that would then, leak it out on a regular basis at the appropriate doses, or birth control, or you just go in and get vaccinated once, and then the right things happen instead of having to come back again and again, that would make a huge difference. Now that's kind of a material science. It's a combination of various sciences that would give us a great solution like that. The issues of heating, lighting, air conditioning, those are purely engineering problems. The energy infrastructure, those are purely engineering problems. And so even some things that may at first look like medical problems, like keeping these vaccines cold, it's really engineers who are going to come in and give us, say, the magic thermos, that leaks heat so little that we don't need an active power source to be able to do that kind of delivery, or give us some laser shooting type device that can kill mosquitoes and be a key tool in the malaria eradication. So in almost every disease, there are things that go well beyond the normal bounds of biology that we'd like to see as tools that would make a huge difference.
Thank you. So we have a questioner right at the back, and then I'll come to you.
Hi, John Owen from General Motors. Excuse me, General Motors. Throughout the last couple of days, at different points in time, the topic of intellectual property has come up, and we've seen different perspectives of whether you protect it or whether you make it fully available to and your own example of the malaria vaccine versus the profit motive of working on baldness. I'm just wondering, moving from the private sectors you have into the foundation, has that transition transformed any of your thoughts about intellectual property and when to protect and how to protect?
Yeah, the intellectual property area is very complex, but overwhelmingly it's important to have intellectual property. For the foundation, the pharmaceutical companies are our key partners, and they're basically the people who've made advances in drug discovery and vaccines. And so for something like the malaria vaccine, we give them grants, but we rely on their expertise, and they're giving us a lot of their very best scientists, their very best work at either for free or at very, very low cost. And whenever there's drugs invented for rich world, they're able to use a tiered pricing approach that basically provides those things at cost for the various poorest countries. And with AIDS drugs, we've seen that work very well. With vaccines, we've seen that work very well. So because of the huge fixed costs that they need to incur, fortunately, most of our diseases, there is still some burden in the rich world. So take tuberculosis. They're willing to put some of the costs of inventing the drugs and the vaccine on a for-profit basis. For example, Sanofi did the dengue vaccine without any philanthropic support at all. Looks like it's only partially effective, but they'll do a new iteration. So that's a disease that's in enough middle-income countries that they didn't require our assistance whatsoever. TB is one that'll be mixed, where there will be some market and it'll have to be done partly philanthropic. Malaria vaccine is pretty unique in that there's almost no commercial market for it because rich people can use prophylaxis. And so that one will have to be overwhelmingly government and philanthropically funded. So, when the pharmaceutical companies are encouraged to do more R&D, when governments put more money into basic R&D, that's very good. Now, having an intellectual property system that strikes the right balance, what should the length of the patents be? What should those, data things do? What's the degree of novelty? That's very complex. But overwhelmingly, if you look at the U.S. system, whether it's in the IT field, the biological field, any other field, it's basically a system that's worked well. And so although people talk about the flaws, there's a lot of merit to that system, going all the way back to Thomas Jefferson and the steam engine patents that worked in the UK. And so although some reform stuff can help, overall it's a system that I think is critically important.
Thank you. Our next question at the front here.
Hi, Mr. Gates. My name is Sujata Bhatia. I teach biomedical engineering at Harvard University. First, I want to thank you. And second, we just had a session on resilience, meaning, making systems that can withstand shocks and stresses while still maintaining essential functions, like, for example, during a disaster. And it strikes me as a biomedical engineer that we already know about a system that withstands shocks and stresses while maintaining essential functions, and that's the human body. So my question for you is, do you think, as someone who has worked at the intersection of medicine and engineering with all the work you've done on vaccines, do you think that when we're engineering some of these new civil systems, that maybe we could learn some things from medicine and from the functioning of the human body? Thank you.
Well, certainly we should learn everything we can from the human body. But of course, there's a lot about, say the immune system that's still pretty mysterious. And as we're looking for something like an AIDS vaccine, it's forcing us to learn a lot more of those things. So that basic research will have a lot of benefits besides what it does for us in terms of an AIDS vaccine. The basic idea of, searching for intruders, attacking those intruders, a lot of the so-called antivirus software is called exactly that because of the direct biological analogies that exist there. And there are new creative ideas in computer security that are drawing on biological equivalents. The unfortunate thing about the IT world is that many things operate at the speed of light. And so the ability to react to a problem, it's much more difficult. An electric power system, the amount of time you have to react when things get out of equilibrium, it's very, very difficult. And of course, nature uses genetic variability where it's willing to let entire lines die off in order to seek the solution that fits the new environment. And we're a little bit selfish about not wanting our branch of evolution to die off like most species do. So we're trying to do something a bit unnatural in terms of preserving one species and having these incredibly complex systems. Can we afford to have lots of variety into systems so that you don't have systemic flaws that span large geographies? You get that discussion, say, in terms of crops. How much do you want to have varieties in the crops so that some disease that comes along can't cause a huge problem for you? There are questions of who should fund the characteristics of the system, like the extra capacity that you want. For example, when the flu epidemic came along, who is supposed to have the standby antiviral or vaccine production capacity that wouldn't be needed in normal times, but that was available there? And we're very fortunate that that flu vaccine ended up being fairly benign because the world had very finite vaccine capacity. It was very slow to get the vaccine, and it would have been kind of haphazard in terms of where it actually would have been used. Now, over time, we want to get vaccine manufacture onto a standard cell line, move away from egg manufacture, and get the latency down. So we could take over lower priority things and change their purpose. So that's the case where the engineering of a general system that can be moved from one use to another would make a huge difference there. I do think these resilience issues are very difficult because they span government. Often they're global in nature, which we don't have much global governance as we're seeing for things like climate change. They get into the private sector, they get into science, and they get into this basic thing of how worried are you about the problem. Often the problems we deal with are ones where there's at least small instances of that keep us aware of the problem. So, small earthquakes make us think about big earthquakes. Small cyber attacks make us think about big cyber attacks. The ones that are almost the scariest are ones where we lose sight of the problem altogether, because when it comes, it comes in a fairly large form, and we haven't created that kind of backup capacity. Everybody can have their own opinion. Is the world properly prepared, even for the most straightforward thing, which is a flu epidemic? And I certainly wouldn't give the world a high grade on the lessons we took from the last thing and what we've done to create that resilience. So it's certainly a work in progress, and there'll be some problems that we wish we'd been better planned for.
Bill, we have another audience up in Birmingham who are following this summit and listening in, and they're sending through questions to me. So I have one from them to read out to you. With an ever-increasing population and the fear around GM crops from some quarters as a solution to food shortages, what else can be done to address feeding the world or keeping population growth in check?
Well, first of all, there's good news here. We don't have an ever-increasing population. That is, the birth cohort, which is now 135 million a year, has reached a peak. And the basic equation for how we go from 7 billion to 10 billion is we're filling out the other age cohorts. Anybody who wants to see this explained in a very brilliant, easy to understand form should look at the Hans Rosling lectures about this. So we will reach a point, but it's a very high point. 10 billion with very intense diets means that we need almost a factor of 2 in terms of our calorie production. And in fact, conventional breeding will get us some of that, but I think there's very little doubt that the techniques of GMO will be needed for the drought resilience, the salt resilience, the various characteristics that we need. And it is very heartening that people like Mark Pollan, who had been very against the science of improving the seeds, took another hard look, came around and said, wait a minute, the evidence is quite clear here that it's less pesticide use, it's not forcing us to put land into cultivation that we shouldn't use otherwise. So, I'm a huge believer in we've got to meet this need, we've got to meet it in a just way, we have to meet it in a sustainable way. And I think science is part of the answer to that. And, it's really got to be a challenge to all of us that we haven't articulated, what the safety process is, what the actual results are there. I am starting to see some changes on the edge there. Particularly with African countries saying, hey, we're sovereign, we need to feed our people. We're willing to look at these tools, particularly as things like cassava disease that is quite rampant right now. The tool, which is a RNA interference approach, is the only way to help those poor farmers.
Thank you. Okay, well, that plenty of hands still up there. We only have about 4 minutes left, and I've got a queue of people that I want to go to in order. Our next questioner is over there.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Gates. I am Hari Pujar. I'm from Merck Vaccines. First of all, thank you so much for the tremendous support your foundation and Gavi have provided for extending vaccines to the developing world. That's a tremendous effort and has had a huge impact. I could ask you 1,000 questions, but the one question I wanted to ask you here was, in your interactions with developing country vaccine manufacturers, have you seen anything that you said to yourself, geez, I wish the Mercks and the GlaxoSmithKlines did this? What would that be? Thank you.
Well, the biggest innovation in vaccines has come from the US and European companies. They have done basically all the novel vaccines. The developing world manufacturers like CMBG in China, Serum Institute or Bharat in India are performing a very important role in terms of providing large-scale, low-price vaccines. So, for example, for measles or measles rubella, that has come, or OPV, a lot of that has come from these developing world manufacturers. Over time, we should hope that they also get into doing novel adjuvants, novel vectors, novel type of vaccines. But as you know, that requires a very deep level of science and lots of investment. So I expect that's probably in the 10 to 20 year time frame. The sooner that happens for the world, the better. Whenever medicines save lives, you don't necessarily look and worry about where it's made. For now, it's the innovations of the Merck, GSK, Sanofi, Pfizer that the world is using, and their relationship with biotech companies. That's the innovation that's really powered the vaccine miracle, and we should all want that to broaden. And I see it happening, but on a fairly gradual pace.
Okay, well, miraculously, my timer here has reset for another 8 minutes to go, because that's how long we have on the satellite feed. So it means we do have time for another maybe a couple of questions. So there's one up in the gallery there. I don't know if the camera will be blinded by the light, if you can see you. Yes?
Hello, Tolleson Humphrey from Duke University. And I have a question concerning, I guess, this top-down innovation from the Western world to the developing world. And I want to know what the Gates Foundation is doing in order to build infrastructure in these developing countries. As Dr. Juma was saying earlier in the sustainability lecture, to increase the entrepreneurship and the development of solutions from the people themselves.
Yeah, I have a couple comments to that. we fund the National Academies of Sciences in various African countries, and we do absolutely as much of the work we can in the developing world. In fact, particularly as we get into trials on these new medicines, the overwhelming percentage is actually spent in the developing countries. So we have a thing called the Grand Challenge program Grand Challenge Exploration, where we pose problems, and we've set the threshold for somebody from a developing country much lower because they're not as used to applying, and we absolutely want to draw them in a very strong way, and we've seen a very good response to that. So far, a little bit more from Asia than from Africa, but we're working on getting that increase there. I do believe that wherever malaria vaccine comes from, it is a good thing. So we need to build up science in these countries. At the same time, we should use global science as much as we can. And it's wonderful to see the collaborations that take place between the rich world academic institutions and the developing world universities. Having said that, if you look at Africa, other than South Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, we still have so far to go to develop the kind of institutions that have long-term support so they can pull their weight in making these contributions. And so, whether it's outside funding, getting those governments to make it a priority, there's still a lot to be done there that may take several decades to fully achieve.
Thank you. Our next questioner here.
Hello, Mr. Gates. I'm Paul Clarkson of Rolls-Royce. The entire past few days have been very inspiring and I'm very optimistic about the future of what engineering can achieve. It says on the wall there, exploring collaborative approaches to tackling global grand challenges. I was wondering where you see the role of people of such influence as yourself, and how you could potentially help the societies in both the UK, US and China to tackling these grand challenges and actually addressing the problems. Thank you.
Well, in general, one flaw of capitalism is that it'll tend to underinvest in research and constantly reminding governments that they have to help, whether it's basic engineering, basic science, biology, they've got to step in on that. I think that's very important. And certainly the track record of what's come out of those investments is very, very strong. The US has been the strongest on that, but now even that, with the budget challenges, it's not clear it'll continue the upward slope that it's had. And most other countries haven't risen to quite that same level. We have programs with a number of countries. For example, we have one with China where the Ministry of Science there, anything that the foundation identifies as being particularly beneficial to poor people, they'll match 2-for-1 any of the science investments we're making. And it's been interesting. A lot of them are more engineering oriented because they're a little further along in their engineering excellence than in biology. So for example, a lot of tools that have to do with farming, for example, no-till farming with very inexpensive tools, we found that they have those, and those are going to make a contribution. We have a similar arrangement with Brazil. It's not quite as broad, but already it's having some impact there. So a reminder that we need to invest in these things is important. At a certain level, for many of the challenges you've identified, there is a large for-profit market, and that will kick in. Energy, providing cheap energy, that is a very, very large market. We have a few that the market alone won't be enough on, and that's where aid and philanthropy come along. In fact, I wish, as I looked at the 14 goals, I wished that the equity of getting the poorest up to where we are had been a little more evident in those 14 goals.
Bill, thank you very much. I don't want to risk the satellite feed cutting out, so I'm afraid I'm going to have to draw the discussion to the close. Apologies to everyone who still had questions to ask. So on behalf of the National Academy of Engineering, the Royal Academy of Engineering, the Chinese Academy of Engineering, thank you ever so much for joining us and giving us your time and thoughts. Ladies and gentlemen, Bill Gates.